Hey everybody, this is Marty Otanias and I'm welcoming you to the class, and I'm going to introduce this first video for week number 2, or first video overall in the semester, by going through a few things that's going to sort of lay the foundation for the course, and then also ensure that I'm around to answer any questions or provide clarification for anything in the syllabus, whether it's assignments or the discussions or the field trips. What I'm going to do in the video is talk about myself, and then also go through the readings briefly, and then discuss a little bit about neoliberalism and governmentality, just to kind of give you an idea of how diversity studies links into some of these larger questions and processes happening today in 2018. So a bit about me. So here's an image from Argentina. I'm a professor doing cultural anthropological research, medical anthropological research, policy anthropology, activist anthropology. So what I've done for the most part of my career, about 20 years or so, is looking at men, women, and children that grow tobacco in developing countries. Specifically, I look at Malawi in Central Africa. I'd be really keen to know which of you, without looking at the internet or a map, can name the 3 countries that surround Malawi. So what I've done is done ethnographic work, collecting stories and data on the lives of men, women, and children that grow tobacco, to try to understand how their living conditions are connected to the practices of global cigarette makers and leaf buying companies. So that's one of the things I do with my approach to anthropology. This slide just kind of briefly gives you some details on some of my publications, and I do a few different things besides stuff in Central Africa and other developing countries regarding tobacco. I have this process or methodology that I work on called digital storytelling, and so I've published recently this year with a colleague in the political science department at CU Denver, Jim Walsh. He does organic theater, and we wrote a piece about using these methodologies in courses. And a couple other things you might be interested. The bottom one is I was a co-editor on a book about visual research strategies. A couple of my current projects, essentially these are titles of papers, manuscripts I'm working on with different collaborators. One is writing up about a digital storytelling project with pregnant and parenting teenagers at a high school for teenagers who are pregnant or parenting here in Denver, called Florence Crittenden. So I'm writing that up, and then also a project in collaboration with Project Voice out of Northeast Denver, looking at gentrification and other kinds of things. And then the third study there is actually about cannabis. I'm interested in workers and their knowledge regarding health conditions and safety concerns, specifically powdery mildew and mold. So that's a project I'm working on. And then my stuff in Malawi has expanded from different kinds of issues to human trafficking and forced labor in the tobacco growing sector. And then some of us in anthropology, we try to get visibility on our work, and so we're able to get media coverage. And so here's a couple recent stories that kind of talk about some of the work that I've been spending time on. So in addition to traditional publications, I also do videos, and a couple of my early videos, the top left, the black DVD, that's called Tangata. That essentially was a short documentary that came out before I wrote the dissertation from UC Irvine in Southern California about tobacco and tobacco farming and bad practices of tobacco companies. So what happened is I made the video, and I got some great help from people at the global level, and then that eventually sort of launched my career assembling visual imagery on issues that affect people throughout the world. And so I really am a strong advocate for using visual imagery as a way to disseminate knowledge, and of course to build bridges between the university and communities that we're supposed to serve. Also, I've done a couple nursing projects, a long story, but essentially I have a couple nursing projects to increase the diversity in the nursing field. And then I did a project a couple of years ago with a colleague at the University of College London, the bottom left there, called Umodzi. And it's a short film, about 12 minutes, that basically looks at child and maternal mortality in Malawi. The other thing I've done besides DVDs and documentary films and digital storytelling projects is I also created my own TV show. It's called Getting High on Anthropology, and this is just a recent flyer I sent around through the listserv at Denver Open Media, which is a community-based public TV station here in Denver, about a mile from campus. I created the TV show because I wanted to make sure people have access to non-fee-based educational material about the cannabis sector. And so I basically interviewed people and chat with them, and this was a flyer to recruit volunteers. The way the television station works, it's a volunteer-based system. And if you're interested to learn more, just visit fsandgreen.org. And I think since 2017 or 16, I've done about 53 episodes. They're all about 30 minutes. And it's just sort of like a fireside chat to learn about what innovative people are doing in the cannabis sector along research or funding or educational lines. A little more about me, courses. I teach a range of courses. I'm going to be teaching Exploring Culture Through Social Media in the spring of 19, also Anthropology and Community-Based Participatory Research. Some of the more exciting courses at the bottom, Cannabis Culture, usually a Maymester course. And then I just developed 2 new courses that are study abroad courses. Hemp Culture in the Dutch Bio-Based Economy in the Netherlands in June 19, and then Media Anthropology and Visual Culture in Malawi. If you're interested, let me know, because I did hear that there may be full scholarships available for applicants, and then also for out-of-state people. I understand the tuition is the same as if you were in-state. So great opportunity to go abroad in a structured format, have some fun, and get some units quickly. I believe 12, 13 days roughly is what my courses are that are in the study abroad program. Lastly, I have an online presence. Feel free to check out any of these websites. And it's just part of my work to bring visibility to my work, but also for networking. So in other words, I use social media as a tool, an educational tool, and of course a networking tool. Oh, one more thing. I'm working with our faculty and others in our department here at UC Denver to try to drive traffic to our Facebook page, which is a bit dated and I would say dormant, but if anyone has ideas or is interested to maybe assist and potentially get paid, I got to look into it, but there may be paid opportunities to try to increase CU Denver's anthropology department's online presence. All right, so back to the material, specifically diversity. Welcome to Diversity Studies. I recognize that people aren't in the class because they are in love with diversity, and you're pretty much required to take a course to meet some kind of requirement. So I think let's do our best to have fun, and honestly the course is meant to challenge you, to get you to think differently about your own identities, but also how you perceive the world. And I think sadly, anecdotally, what most people come out of this class typically having their stereotypes and views about the world reinforced, as opposed to enlightened, or having an enlightened approach, because it's really difficult to sort of step outside of oneself and think differently about your own lives and of course the lives of others. So if we can have a group goal to ensure that we all do our best to be open and recognize that how we live our life, how we perceive things, is sort of just one approach to looking at the world in terms of diversity. So a couple things, most of this stuff, key points out of the Kotak reading, Culture in America. Our nation was founded on unity and diversity. The United States itself, the name kind of is emblematic of diversity. The nation founded on and endure through effective subordination of individual differences within a smoothly functioning multi-ethnic team. So in other words, we have a foundation as a nation where diversity sort of makes up who we are. There's different diversity components: ethnicity, race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, age, class, occupation, region, and differential physical, mental abilities. And of course there's others, but these are some of the main things that's raised by Kotak in one of the chapter 1 and 2. Also, when you talk about language and communication, which is one of the vehicles to understand other cultures, especially at the level of diversity. All human behavior originates in the use of language. And so just last night I was talking about an 11-year-old son who sort of just discovered The Simpsons, and he was fascinated by the use of language in that show and how that culture of The Simpsons has this very specialized language specifically. And I'm not a super fan or a regular watcher of The Simpsons, but I know a little bit about them. That phrase DOH, do. So I was talking to him about that, and it's kind of just reflective of how language is so important. And in fact, even in that Darmok episode of Star Trek that's an optional viewing for this week, I totally recommend you check it out, because it talks about how two different groups communicate with each other or learn to communicate with each other, and the source of the communication is through metaphor, which is very different, but it just shows how valuable human communication is, and the role of language. So if you haven't seen it, it's very interesting. Check it out, Darmok. Another key point about language and communication: language links individuals together by serving as a means of understanding how each group of individuals relates to another. A question to ask yourself: what are problems facing people who speak different languages? Some of you who had a chance to go abroad in the past, or if you come from a bicultural family and you have family members at the extended level that speak a language other than your own, or maybe you're not fluent in your main language, you may have experienced directly what it's like to try to communicate with people who don't necessarily have English as their first language. A little side note, linguistics is one of the four fields of anthropology. In the discipline of anthropology, there's four fields: linguistics, which deals with language and communication; cultural anthropology, which is my expertise; then we have physical or / biological anthropology, and then we have archaeology. Our department at CU Denver focuses on three of those areas, excluding linguistics. And I know there's been a huge demand recently, since I've been here since '08, to offer more classes in linguistics or language and communication. But our department is a small department, and we have courses mainly in the other three areas: archaeology, physical / biological anthropology, and cultural anthropology. The cultural anthropology specifically focuses on medical anthropology, which is a sub-area of cultural anthropology. And of course, the visual anthropology or media anthropology, which is one of my fields also that I'm developing with colleagues in the department. Okay, a couple things about diversity. To understand another culture fully, you must try to see how the people in that culture see things. What motivates them, what are they thinking, when they do those things. Such an approach does not preclude making moral judgments or taking action. So in other words, what we do as anthropologists, we try to understand other cultures from their perspective as best we can. And of course, then we merge that with our own interpretations and explanations. Now, studying culture is really complex, very slippery. What does it mean to be part of, and then I put here, insert your own culture. So if you're a Latina, or if you're into skateboarding, or if you're into electronic dance music, whatever, what does it mean to be a part of that culture? And so a couple of things in terms of our approach as anthropologists: we look at it in three ways: holistically, in a comparative fashion, and global. Holistic, we study the whole human condition. That includes biological and cultural variation in time and space. So in other words, anthropologists take a holistic approach. We typically take a comparative approach. We contrast cultures to understand similarities, differences, and increase empathy for groups seeking security and integrity. And at the global level, individuals and cultures in different parts of the world, household, community, state, nation, region, and international levels are some of the areas that we look at. So in other words, anthropology, especially cultural anthropology, is not just looking at tribes in the most remote parts of Brazil or in the continent of Africa. So we actually examine undergrads at UC Denver. We look at high school students who vape. The fun about being an anthropologist is you can pretty much set the boundaries and set the parameters around the culture you want to study. You just have to be very clear to emphasize that cultures are fluid and constantly changing. Next slide. A little break, if you want, a 2 to 3 minute video, is this social nomics, and it comes out every year. I think this is the 8th version, and it basically synthesizes how people today are tied to technology and the role of technology in our lives. And so it basically is a montage of these different anecdotes and facts that are super interesting, and it's kind of upbeat with some hip song. But definitely take a break and check it out, because these are things that are important and happening around us and possibly in your own lives that you may find interesting. It's a cool little video. And you are free, if you want to look at this as a resource to write about also in your discussion text that you produce. All right, diversity. A couple things to emphasize. The approach I take in this course is I do take a critical approach to diversity. So we will also be looking at the landscape of diversity in which the University of Colorado Denver operates. So it's good to point out that we have in our strategic approach to diversity and inclusion a couple important things, goals, or a part of our strategic plan, a priority number 5, to enhance diversity university-wide and to foster a culture of inclusion. So in other words, this is a key issue in who we are as an institution. The critique is, do we do it well? And then, of course, what's the criteria set up to determine whether we actually meet this priority number 5? And then what is your role or your take or your critical understanding of it? So just to emphasize, our university, like many institutions, pushes diversity. It's another thing in practice to see how it actually unfolds. And we will have a module or two in the course that actually looks at faculty of color and some of the challenges that they face. Let's turn now to Ortner. She's an anthropologist. You read her piece, Dark Anthropology. And I wanted to start with this paper because it sort of provides a foundation for some of the key anthropological concepts and terms and theories and characters that are kind of prominent in this era. And so for those of you that are new to the discipline of anthropology, it just is an overview, again, to give you a view of what's happening in our field, according to author Ortner. So the main thing, especially in this class also, we have a socio-cultural anthropological theoretical approach. These ancestors are the key thinkers, and they also are individuals that create fissures and fractures. In other words, there's constant debate and discussion about whether these characters got it right, got it wrong, and what new scholars can do to build on what the past folks have done. And there's been a shift in theory due to internal critiques and actual conditions of neoliberalism. And I'll talk a lot about neoliberalism in a few minutes, just so we have a grasp of what it is, because it's something that people say it's entrapped us today in 2018, and it also has sort of charted a path in terms of the direction of the world that has set constraints for achieving diversity. And of course, how may theory be applied to the study of diversity? One of the things that to think about when you read and reflect on Ortner's Dark Anthropology. Academic work, at least in the social sciences and in diversity studies specifically, cannot be detached from the conditions of the real world in which it takes place. In other words, as we move through the course and we look at different scholars, different approaches, we try in the field of anthropology and the wider area of social sciences to ensure that we acknowledge and interrogate the landscape or the context in which these things are being produced, because they have an impact. You know, for example, if I was to write about diversity in the cannabis sector, and trying to increase people of color who are not just trimmers, those people, you know, taking apart the leaves and presenting the buds in a beautiful manner, but we want to look at people of color who own dispensaries and who have access to capital. You can't deny that the fact of the Trump administration, for example, at the federal level, has a role to play in terms of Schedule 1, where cannabis is situated, and whether or not they decide to implement the law or to choose not to implement the law. At the moment, Colorado and other states have legalized cannabis. So at the state level, we are steamrolling forward, but at the federal level, there's a law that says it's a violation, but the feds choose not to implement the law. So the point is, when we do our studies of culture and cultural groups, we try to ensure we acknowledge the larger context in which some of the things are happening. A couple other points about Ortner and areas of work and neoliberalism. Again, I'm trying to telescope to a broader level that diversity is not just about ensuring that there's equal numbers of cultures represented in a classroom or at a university, or that we acknowledge that there's a diversity of opinions, whether it's looking at religion or political systems, but recognizing that there's something happening at the global level that is influencing the way diversity unfolds. So according to the author, this dark anthropology is a window into issues of power, exploitation, inequality. It could be seen as kind of looking at these negative things, or those things that are more oppressive, structures that sort of keep people down and not allowing people to achieve, dignity in the workplace or dignity in their own lives. So that's kind of the area or arena of dark anthropology, is an emphasis on those things. And then you have anthropologies of the good, looking at value, looking at hope, looking at imagination, looking at empathy. And a simple way to think about that is it's easy when you do research to come up with a laundry list of all the things that are really crappy that people have to experience. Let's say I'm looking at undergrad students at CU Denver. I can look at all the difficulties people face, whether time deficits, whether commuting, the high value of rent, the inability to have regular healthy meals, the lack of exercise. So if I was to take anthropologies of the good, I would maybe find a couple people who are doing things well and then highlight the strategies that they deploy to stay healthy, to be on top and not procrastinate, and navigate the financial stress. So it's just the author presents two major orientations of doing anthropology. There's also resistance studies, anti-globalization and anti-neoliberalism movements, which are really, really important to essentially hold governments or hold corporations accountable. And of course, an upbeat area is the ethics of possibility. What are the different things that potentially could happen that could influence and change things for the better? So key question, how can we both be realistic about the ugly realities of the world today and hopeful about the possibilities of changing them? In other words, increasing diversity. So if you wish, and again, I want to keep some of the discussions open to allow you to gravitate toward the things you find are interesting, but if you wish, this is a great question if you wanted to use this as a linchpin for your response in the discussion. In other words, answer the question, how can we be both realistic about the ugly realities of the world today and hopeful about the possibilities of changing them? In other words, increasing diversity. So if you do choose to respond, one strategy is use direct quotes to help substantiate your points. Use an anecdote or two, and then of course elaborate your arguments and then restate at the very end of your discussion why this is important, especially for diversity studies and or anthropology as it relates to diversity. All right, moving on. The author Ortner was really good at sort of giving a laundry list of some of the ancestors or characters that have come before us and contributed to the intellectual foundation of theoretical work in anthropology. And so these are a couple of the characters. And by the way, resources available for you are always in the list of references. Ortner has 118 citations. So if you find you're doing work in the course for a project, resources that are right in front of you at your fingertips are the references and citations from other authors. And you just read the title. If you like what you find, go to the library website, go to databases, look for G, go to Google Scholar, type in Marx and whatever, and then you will find current readings that may be helpful for you, or that exact reading from the list of references. So just that was a little side note to ensure that you know you have resources at your fingertip, in addition to myself as well as the librarians who are always ready and willing to help you remotely, through the main page of the library. A couple other characters, Kelly, Robbins, Fisher, and Lambeck. These are sort of ancestors of the good. These are the dark ones, going back and forth. And then a couple last slides, a couple key constructs that are happening in terms of intellectual attention to them as resources to help understand the world, especially along cultural lines and diversity lines. Hegemony, accumulation by dispossession, structures of feeling, carceral state, violence by the state against citizens, and a bunch of others. The key thing I want to focus on is neoliberalism. It's an economic system and a system of governmentality. And there is a field called the anthropology of neoliberalism. And a couple bullet points are here. You have worldwide political economic restructuring. So there's transformations of capitalism. Ortner calls brutal form of capitalism. Then you have a social and cultural phenomenon, which is what neoliberalism is, with its effects on inequality and diversity. Neoliberalism influences sites, institutions, processes, and practices. One of the main things about neoliberalism is this idea that we want small government and low tax. So the implication is the social net, the resources provided by the government in the past to help folks who are disenfranchised or maybe have a lack of financial capital to meet basic needs, many of those are being cut. And some of those resources came from taxes. And so when you cut taxes, that typically reduces resources available to provide a safety net for people. And the flip side of that is rules are being changed to ensure that corporations have more rights to do what they need to do, which is to provide services, provide goods, but also ensure that their stakeholders or the individuals who own stockholders, have a steady flow of revenue, of profit. And then lastly, neoliberalism, according to Harvey, who was the main characters, it's a political ideological project of a class seeking to change the balance of power in global capitalism and create new means of capital accumulation. So in other words, this slide is a nice definition that's tangible to understand what neoliberalism is. And of course, there's more details in Ortner's article. Oh, a couple other slides, and then I'm almost done. And thanks for your patience for watching this. Going deeper in terms of how you understand diversity, neoliberalism, foreign external aid dependence of a particular country. So in other words, these are areas that people have gone down to apply neoliberalism as a conceptual framework or a device to understand culture. So you have other countries in the world, mostly non-dominant countries, that are relying on external aid because they can't generate enough income or revenues in their own countries. So when you have aid dependence, that restricts the power of a particular country and it increases the power of other countries. And that could be economic aid, it could be military aid. So these are some things that are related to diversity and basically restrict the number of voices that are able to have influence in the world. And then you can read the list here. I'll go to the bottom one. Going deeper, engagement with resistance movements, oppositional political work, anti-globalization, anti-capitalist social justice groups. So in other words, what we do when you go deeper with neoliberalism is not just provide an analysis of how things are difficult for people, but you can also provide support as a scholar, as a researcher, as an ethnographer, to actually help resistance movements do their job and providing them with support, providing them with funds, or using the research to aid a particular agenda. And that's kind of another thing that some scholars, anthropologists do. Last slide. Ending on concerns regarding neoliberalism. Number one, utility of neoliberalism as a theoretical construct. So some people argue, if you're in diversity studies, what value, and you can ask this for any concept, any theory, what value is neoliberalism as a theoretical idea or orientation? So that's something that we reflect on and try to be explicit to state what the value of it is. And usually it's providing new knowledge, answering or opening up new questions, and then of course ensuring that our discipline is accountable to some of the things that are happening in the world. Number two, in what ways can neoliberalism own institutions of global economic governance be transformed? What's interesting here is some people have different approaches. If you find a financial institution at the global level, like the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, doing bad practices of keeping countries in debt, some people think, oh, I'm going to go work for them and from inside reform the structures. Others work outside and try to reform or transform from the outside. So there's different approaches to solutions and remedies. Thirdly, what individuals and or collective action effectively contests or tries to limit or reduce or obstruct neoliberalism? In other words, are you familiar with any groups locally, regionally, globally that have raised their voices, ordinary people's voices, to try to confront head on some of the problems from the world capitalist system? And again, another kind of question or discussion point you can go off of. Okay, that's a wrap up for me. So I'm going to thank you again. A reminder, contact me anytime. This Thursday from 6 to 7 is a live meeting, and it's really just a chance for us to, as a group, kind of see each other, talk about any issues. It'll be, I'll have each of you just kind of tell me about yourself, or ask a question about the course. And I have a few more things to just clarify. And I'm going to end in over and out. And you guys have a great day. Thanks.